reading all three of these texts consecutively in order that we might gain the entire picture, particularly of this event, but also with regard to what is found in the lesson itself. Because there's a whole lot written in Matthew and Mark and very little written in Luke, but there is some really interesting additional information in Luke's account. So we're going to read beginning in Matthew 14, beginning in verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, "Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter." The king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. All right, now let's go over to Mark chapter 6. In Mark chapter 6, we're going to begin in verse 14. And this talks about Herod's interest in Jesus. It's the same account, but it speaks to why the earlier discussion about John's resurrection, so-called or idea of his resurrection, came about. It said, "Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known." That's talking about Jesus, okay, not John. "And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said it is Elijah, and others said it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, This is John whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles and the high officers and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. So she went out and asked her mother, What shall I ask? And she said, The head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded John in prison. Brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Now, very quickly, Luke chapter 9. Beginning in verse 7. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, again talking about Jesus, And he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the old prophets had risen again. Herod said, John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? So he sought to see him. And so we have this collection of accounts surrounding the death of John the Baptist and Herod's initial interest in the Lord. When the Bible says Herod the Tetrarch, it is speaking of Herod Antipas. Now, when Herod the Great died, his kingdom was divided into 4 areas, 4 regions. And that's why the word tetrarch comes into play, because tetrarch means one of 4, one of 4 rulers. And so the kingdom of Herod the Great was divided among 4 of his descendants. Herod Antipas, who was called Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Archelaus, of whom we read early in the life of Jesus, then Philip, who's mentioned in this particular text, who ruled over the northeastern area of the land, and then a sister by the name of Salome the first. And she ruled briefly over the area that was along the southwest, along the shores of the Mediterranean. She did not reign for very long, and when she died, her kingdom was absorbed into Judea. And when Herod Archelaus died, his kingdom was absorbed into Syria. But just kind of giving you an idea of who it is that we're talking about. Herod Antipas was one of the sons of Herod the Great. And so if you see Antipas or you see Herod the Tetrarch, you're talking or reading about the same individual. So now we try to put this whole thing, kind of piece it together on a timeline. The first thing we know is that John had been placed in prison likely before the time that Jesus had sent out the 12 and the 70. All right? And then you have all of these men who are going throughout all the area. They're going throughout Galilee. They're going throughout Judea. They're preaching the gospel. They are all working miracles because they've all been empowered by the Lord to work the miracles to confirm their message. And during this time, Herod puts John to death. It seems as though right around this time is the time that Herod put John to death. When all of these deeds that have been done by Jesus and all of these deeds are being done by his disciples, Herod finally gains an interest in Jesus. And it seems to be that Herod is influenced. This is my take. Herod is influenced by his guilt, because he knows what he did. And as the text said, Herod knew that John was a just and holy man. Now, some things that are in the text that sometimes escape us, because we speak generally that Herod had put John in prison. And while that is technically true, it was not Herod's doing. It was Herodias' doing. Did you pick up on that in the text? That he imprisoned Philip because of Herodias' sake. Because she wanted John in prison. Herod didn't want John in prison. She wanted John in prison. And why did she want John in prison? Because John spoke the truth about her marriage situation to Herod, who had, I don't want to use the word stolen, that's not the right word, but he had in some way convinced Herodias to leave her husband Philip and to be married to him. Now, this particular relationship violated a number of Jewish laws. That's why John said to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." All right. Now, upon hearing this statement from John, Herodias takes it on. She strong arms Herod into arresting John. And if you picked it up in the text, she's the one that wanted John dead. You know, the text tells us, now look, when it almost seems like a contradiction, but when we understand the entirety of the situation, it makes more sense. One of the texts says Herod wanted to put him to death. But Mark 6 and verse 20 says Herod did not want to put him to death, but rather protected him. And so the way I look at this is, Herod wanted some relief from his sorry wife. In other words, there was a sense in which if he would put John to death, it would make things easier on him at home. But he didn't want to put John to death because he knew the character and the type of man that John was, and he knew that John was telling him the truth. And the Bible tells us that, again, this thing seems so strange, that Herod enjoyed having John in his presence. So, and that can tell us a number of things about Herod. You know, number one, it tells us that Herod had no intention of getting right with God. But despite the fact that John told him the truth about his marriage, he liked hearing what John had to say about other things. And so, as I look at Herod in the entirety of this situation, I see that he's struggling internally. He knows who John is. He knows that what John said is right. He enjoys hearing from John. But but when he leaves John, he's got to go back to his wife. What's that, John?
He could have been flipped. He could have been turned. Or it's possible. It is possible.
Yeah, if Herodias had let up on this matter, John would have gone free.
One of the things that stands out, and it's just me, the fact that they almost wanted John the Baptist to be risen, but they rejected Jesus being risen.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that, but they of course they
was willing to accept the possibility that John had risen from the dead. You see what
they accepted the idea that John could be risen, but
the fact that
Jesus was risen from the
dead.
dead.
We got to do something about it so that the people will start believing it.
Right. Now I want to mention one other thing about the timing of all this. In John chapter 3 and in verse number 30, John made a statement. When I say well into his ministry, what I mean is well into his ministry insofar as he preached, because John didn't preach for a long, long time. His ministry was, in the broad scheme of things, pretty brief. Kind of like Jesus' ministry was brief. All right? But John said in John 3 and verse 30, he must increase and I must decrease. In other words, John knew that the time had come for him to leave, to use our terminology, to leave center stage and come into the shadows, and Jesus is going to step forth and enter into the spotlight going forward. And then you have Jesus now sending out his disciples. In other words, we have either we have either 82 or 84, depending. Some renderings say that he sent out 70. Some say he sent out 72 in addition to the apostles. But we have a pretty large contingency of men who are now going everywhere, and they're going as representatives of Jesus and not as representatives of John. And so, they're in a way they're kind of helping to usher in the focus on Jesus. So then you have the death of John the Baptist. And I think in a very real way, I think by Herod putting John to death, he actually helped enable the ministry of Jesus and his disciples. In other words, if there had been any, and obviously there was, loyalty to John the Baptist, the removal of John the Baptist from the scene removed the friction that might have existed between the disciples, between the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of John. And I only say that to show that just like we've talked about in time past, sometimes we're not able to see the big picture of what God is doing until there's some time and space. The time allows us some perspective to see what is going on. And I think Herod actually did the work of Christ a service when he executed John. All right. Then I want to make a passing mention about some of the characters here involved. Primarily Herod and Herodias. Herodias was, in many ways, a first century Jezebel. Although she did not wield the same level of power that Jezebel did. If you remember the case of Ahab and Jezebel, for example, Ahab wanted to buy the vineyard of Naboth. And Naboth said, I ain't selling. This is my inheritance. And by the way, the Jews were forbidden in a lot of instances they were forbidden to sell their inheritance. And so Ahab pitches a fit and goes to bed and turns his face against the wall and pouts, and Jezebel handles it. She brings in 2 false witnesses. They accuse Naboth of blasphemy. She has Naboth put to death, and she goes and lays claim to the vineyard. Now she wielded some serious power, but Herodias also wielded power just through, just for lack of a better term, just by proximity. In other words, she worked to get things done that she wanted done. She got John arrested, but she didn't have enough juice to get him killed. All right? And then we have Herod, who teaches us the lesson of making rash oaths. He made a rash oath. I'll give you whatever you want up to half of my kingdom. By the way, can you think of anybody else? For example, I got one guy in mind in particular who made a rash oath. Made a rash oath to the Lord. Who was it? You're on the right track, Nellie. Jephthah. Jephthah made a vow that if God would deliver his enemies into his hand, that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out to meet him when he got back home, and the first thing that came out the door was his daughter. And the Bible says he did according to his vow. A lot of people, I heard Brother Lewis, can't think of his name now. talk about, said, despite all the mental gymnastics, the text still says what it says, and it says he kept his vow. Yeah, he made a rash oath. And then we also have with Herod the power of influence of our peers. Why did the Bible say that Herod kept his promise to the daughter of Herodias? What does it say? It says it twice. That's exactly right. Because of all the people that he'd gathered around and had heard him say what he said. In other words, it wasn't the fear of his wife that caused him to keep the vow. It was because he was afraid of the shame that would be brought because he had made the vow in front of his companions. By the way, we have an Old Testament parallel to this. When Ahasuerus called for Vashti to come and display herself in front of him and his friends, and she refused to come because she was going to do what was right and not allow herself to be, put on display, for her husband and all of his drunk friends. The friend said, "Hey, wait a minute. If our wives hear what your wife did, then our wives aren't going to listen to us." And so what did he do? He deposed her, which obviously brings in the account, of Esther, being chosen as the queen. But we have a parallel. Something happened, something happened in a group of people. And somebody felt the pressure to do what was wrong when somebody else was trying to do what was right. And so it reminds us, at least it reminds me, that we need to practice moderation. That our lives should be marked by moderation. That our lives should be marked by discipline. Our lives should be marked by discernment. Because we can do and say things that can get us in a bad way in a hurry when we don't. And so we have a number of examples of this, both in the Old and the New Testament. Now, the interesting thing to me, going back to the book itself, the lesson itself on page 13, is in that section where it says Herod takes note of Jesus. In the third paragraph where it begins, Herod decided to seek out Jesus. It's interesting that he never did see Jesus until the day that Jesus died. Or until the events leading up to the death of Jesus. I guess it would have been the day that he died. You remember when Jesus was taken into custody on the night of his betrayal? And Pilate was trying to find some way out of a bad situation. So he sent him to Herod. And the Bible says when Herod heard that Jesus was coming, he was very glad. And here's the text, Luke 23:8. He had wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. In other words, he had an interest in Jesus. But his interest in Jesus was more along the lines of, wanting Jesus to perform some type of parlor trick, rather than hearing what Jesus had to say. And Jesus stood before Pilate, and he didn't say anything or do anything. He didn't, he didn't accommodate Herod. But I just find it interesting because it had never occurred to me that this text that we're studying says Herod wanted to see Jesus, and then all of this time goes by, and Jesus literally has to be brought to him in order for him to see him on the night in which he was betrayed, and then ultimately, when he was crucified. You just wonder. Herod wanted to see him, but how bad did he want to see him? I mean, don't you think Herod could have pulled some strings to see Jesus? I mean, you would think that he would, but he didn't. Again, Herod seems to me to be a great enigma. He's just seems to me like he's a walking contradiction. He seems to be, he's generally unstable. Prone to, obviously he's prone to rashness. He's prone to influence, pressure, and so you have all these things. To me, this tells us so much more about Herod than maybe we would ordinarily think. All right, now let's go down to the bottom of the page, on page 13. It says, the death of John the Baptist. And we've already read the text. All right, it says, the circumstances of John's death is that Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, had taken his half-brother Philip's wife, Herodias, as his own. And John spoke plainly about the immorality of that situation. Herod had arrested John because of him speaking out. Now, here's another thing that I think is interesting. It seems as though John went to Herod and told him that he was in a bad way. In other words, Herod didn't just get hearsay. Hey, here's what John is saying about you and your wife. I mean, the Bible says John told him, as if God had sent him on a mission to go and tell Herod to his face, it is not lawful for you to have her. And apparently Herodias also heard it. And then that's when, we'll call it John's trouble. That's when John's trouble began. All right, let's go to, I'm going to look at this text. I didn't see this in the text. Yeah, it's there. I skipped over it. At the bottom of page 13, it says that Herod feared that the death of one considered a prophet might result in an uprising. And that's Matthew 14:5. It says he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. By the way, do we have another example of that? Where leaders, actually even involving John the Baptist, refused to answer a question because of the fear of the multitude. Matthew chapter 22 or 21. By what authority do you do these things, and who gave you this authority? And Jesus responds, I'll ask you a question. And if you answer my question, I'll answer your question. So they said, say on. The baptism of John, where did it come from? Heaven or men? They gathered off to the side and said, if we say from heaven, he's going to ask, why didn't you listen to him? And if we say of men, we fear the people, because all of them hold John to be a prophet. Isn't it interesting? Herod feared John because he feared the people. And the Pharisees feared the people because the people respected John. Again, so many parallels in this text. All right, top of 14, page 14. So on Herod's birthday, Herodias seized an opportunity with the help of her daughter. The daughter danced to the delight of Herod and his guests. Herod made the promise, and at the prompting of her mother, she asked for the head of John the Baptist. And Herod had no choice but to fulfill her request because of his oath and the guests. We've already talked about that. So, and then we've already talked about the next paragraph. What do we learn from the text? Well, one thing that I haven't mentioned is speaking out against immorality can get you in hot water. When you speak against those things that people are doing that are out of accord with the Word of God, people don't want to hear it. People don't want to hear that what they're doing is sinful. And when people have the authority or the ability to punish you for that, they will do so. They're not going to let it go sit idly by. We talked about rash promises. We talked about saving faith. Now we get down to the middle of the page to the return of the 12. We finished last week talking about how Jesus had sent out the 12. And we said we really didn't know how much time had gone by. But we knew it couldn't be a huge period of time, because Jesus' total ministry was only 3 to 3.5 years. And this is already well into the ministry of Jesus, but also well short of his betrayal and his death. Let's go back to Mark chapter 6. We pick up in verse 30. By the way, Mark 6 and verse 30 doesn't, it does. It gives the timeline of the return of the disciples. It says then. Well, what is then? Well, then is when the disciples came and took the corpse of John the Baptist and buried it. And Matthew's account also says the same. It says, then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a desert place in the boat by themselves. And then we're going to get into a completely different account where Jesus ends up feeding a multitude. But so we have this space of time the events surrounding the death of John. Well, I think John had been in prison sometime because of Matthew chapter 11, because John was in prison and sent his disciples to Jesus and said, are you the one that should come, or do we look for another? And then we get to Matthew 14. So John has been in prison for some time. But the preaching of the 12 takes place during the imprisonment and the death of John the Baptist. It says, they look at the second line under the return of the 12, that Jesus and the 12 regrouped. They likely did this in Capernaum. And it says they reported all that had been done and taught. Down to the next paragraph, the disturbing news of John the Baptist's death came, and Jesus and the 12 retreated to a secluded place. It's almost like they didn't know, they didn't know what had transpired while they were out preaching. And then the last paragraph is, this should have given Jesus some alone time with his disciples. In other words, they all needed time to regroup and rest. They'd been out preaching, they'd been out traveling. They gathered back together. The news of the death of John comes. They're still being thronged by the multitudes, so they've got to get in a boat and go somewhere else. It teaches us that there is a limit. There is a limit physically to what we can do, and that when those physical limits, and we also know that when our physical limits are being reached, it also affects us mentally and emotionally. So Jesus understood the need to disengage even for a short time. Any thoughts or questions on these events? Anything anybody want to add? I'm trying to look at the questions. I think we answered every single one. I think we answered every single one of the questions. Although I don't think we looked at why did Herod view Jesus as a threat. I didn't see that. I didn't see that in the text itself, unless the answer that he wants is that he saw Jesus as a threat because he thought John the Baptist had been risen from the dead. That would be my answer to that. All right. Any thoughts or questions? All right, Lord willing, next week, page 15. Lesson plan, our lesson number 46.